Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 233.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I am back with it started off as a bite size from Rangan Chatterjee. 3 simple habits to reduce stress and avoid burnout. I thought, well, that sounds nice and simple. And it was interesting, but he mentioned in that bite size a lot of the other things he was talking about in the full episode, which sounded interesting. So I went and listened to the full episode, which is called 7 Early Signs of Burnout and 10 Simple and Practical Tools to Help. And in the bite size, he just mentioned really just a few of the simple, practical tools. But I was intrigued to find out what these other things were. So I went and listened to the full episode. And unusually, I think it was a bonus episode he'd thrown in, but unusually it was a solo episode. So it was just him. And I think because it was just him, he'd probably pretty well scripted it, I should think. So he sort of stuck to topics and did actually give all 7 and all 10, yeah. And not sort of focus all his energy on the first 3 and then run out of steam, as so often happens. So it was a really handy episode. So if any of these things are something that you think you might be heading towards, I would strongly recommend going and listening to it, because he just laid it out in a nice, simple way and gave some quite practical tips that we could think about. So he's talking about burnout, and he says it's getting much more common. Pressures from work, society, home life. Apparently, research has shown that 88% of the UK workforce has experienced burnout since 2020. And a survey done in 2020 showed that 1 in 5 people felt unable to manage pressure and stress levels at work. So that's quite a lot. And so he says, what are we talking about here? What is burnout? And he described it as a physical and mental exhaustion, chronic, unmanaged stress. So it doesn't happen overnight, builds up over time, and often people don't realize they're going through it until it gets really, really bad and they get to that burnout point. Some people think that they can just keep pushing, but at some point it's going to come back to bite you. He said that burnout used to have that image, and it's something I kind of thought of it as, had that image of only happening to the sort of real high flyers, but it is just becoming far more common with everyone. Some of the signs that he's talking about, these 7 early signs, he says some of them are really common things and we all experience them from time to time. And if they're short-lived, it's not such a problem. And they can also exist in other conditions like depression. But he says that spotting these signs early could help reduce the chances of burnout. And you can maybe make some small changes early on to just avoid getting to that point. And that's what he's hoping to do with this episode, is to get in there with some preventative things. And I must admit, and it was something I was going to ask you when we got to the end really, but I'll mention it now. He said there that they can also exist in other conditions. And I must admit that I found the 7 signs that might indicate you're on the road to burnout. I felt that you could substitute depression in there, but we'll see what you think. He tries to illustrate a little bit about what is the difference here between stress, so the stress response system, and burnout. He says that some stress is good, and we've talked about this in a lot of episodes. And I think I even fairly recently talked about something where he was talking about that before, where they were talking about building resilience. So, some stress is good and we're built to handle stress, but too much, too often without adequate recovery time and the ability to reset is the problem. And he talks about thinking about it a bit like a rubber band. So if you stretch a rubber band and you let it go, it snaps back. But if you keep stretching it, and you overstretch it, and you keep doing that all the time, at some point it will start to change its shape and the ability to snap back to how it was before. And that's the same kind of thing that can happen to your nervous system. It's the how much, how often, and it starts to change its shape and everything gets distorted. And so that's where, without having this recovery and reset time, you can find yourself on the road to burnout. So what are these 7 signs that might indicate you're on the road to burnout? And he talks about when you just have no energy to work, to connect with others, just really tired and struggling to get through the day-to-day, feeling like you have no motivation or willpower, often feel like you're just being lazy, and you feel like the problem is with you. So the first sign is disconnection. Disconnection from the people around you. You tend to start turning inwards and often engage in some unhelpful behaviours. He cites a statistic here, which I know you've brought up several times. The feeling of being lonely is as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it really can impact your health in a big way. Isolation was a threat way back when you needed your tribe around you for survival. And biological changes occur in your body when you disconnect. So that's the first one. The second one, emotional exhaustion, which is a little bit different from physical exhaustion. Small things start to really bother you and irritate you. You tend to become more cynical and judgmental, and it often also shows up as little outbursts of anger you take out on quite often other people. Third one is lack of creativity. This one often goes under the radar, he says. Work performance will likely start to decline, and thinking of new ideas and problem solving just becomes really hard to do. And the fourth one is inability to gain pleasure from simple everyday things. Things that gave you pleasure before, that just dries up and you struggle to want to do anything. The fifth one is one that we all know and love, procrastination. You know what you want to do, should do, but you don't take the action to do it. You have difficulty in making decisions. The sixth one, self-care starts to disappear. Food choices and habits tend to become worse. Things like binge watching TV, snacking on junk food, etc., and keeps you locked in a destructive cycle. Movement dwindles to as little as possible. Little acts of self-care start slipping, even things like showering, cleaning your teeth, etc. And the last one is physical exhaustion. This is the most common sign associated with burnout. No energy to do anything, chronic fatigue, often feeling tired and wired at the same time. So it's hard to switch off at night. Brain fog is also very common, and you tend to lose self-awareness and clarity of thinking. So if any of these things are sounding familiar for you or someone you know, then maybe you are on the road to burnout. But like I say, that I felt like they could all be listed. They're the kind of things you get asked about if you say you're depressed. I felt like you could switch out that list for depression. I don't know what you think about that before we go on to his 10-step action plan, which also I feel like could be, I know I have like a bit of a fixation about depression, but I genuinely felt that that was a tick list for depression as well as burnout.
I think your point is really important, Daisy. They do have similar symptoms. So do depression and anxiety. So do anxiety and burnout. So does anxiety and ADHD, I think it's often important to think about kind of where those things originate from and what helps. Interestingly, people who struggle more with depression in general are more at risk for experiencing burnout. But they do very much overlap, but I think the way it's kind of differentiated again is experts try to look at depression is a medical diagnosis based on certain factors, whereas burnout is more emotional, physical, and psychological, just, exhaustion and being overtaxed. One example that might help differentiate them a little bit is oftentimes when someone is experiencing burnout, let's say from work, time off can really help, can recharge and refresh. But time off from work when someone's depressed can, for some people, make it worse because work was something that was keeping them going and was giving them a sense of purpose and things. So to me, that's just a great example of seeing that depending on if it's burnout or if it's depression, different strategies, and maybe he talks about some that are very specific to this, but even I'm guessing some of the strategies might sound similar. So I don't think they're completely separate entities that have no overlap. I think you're right on. Then the difference is just kind of figuring out what is it based on, where is it coming from, and what helps it.
Yes, no, that makes sense actually. When you were saying that, it's kind of like the difference between situational depression and chronic depression. If there's a reason for it, and that's the thing, I guess, with burnout. There's likely to actually be a cause for that, and it's usually, he mentioned at the beginning about these work statistics. That's usually where it comes from. But he's saying, that there are all these multi-factorial issues that are coming in. So with somebody, I guess, and I guess you've said this before. With dealing with stress, you might have the amount of stress at work that would cause one person burnout that doesn't cause somebody else burnout, because that one person that it doesn't cause might have a really nice, stable, nurturing home environment. They're not feeling the societal pressures. They switch off from the news or whatever, or they follow some of the action plans. So they can cope with that kind of level of stress at work, but somebody else who's feeling it from too many different directions. So it is very individual, isn't it? Anyway, gone a bit off track there. But so he does have a 10-step action plan. And this is a big thing with him. He's written books about this. It's something that he comes back to all the time. Start small. Don't try and do everything at once. Pick the thing or the things that resonate with you that you could start doing. So the first step is awareness. Don't underestimate the power of awareness. We mentioned this before, that people often don't realize they have burnout until it's too late. So being aware that you're on the road to burnout can be really helpful, because you can start to make the changes that will help. He comes back to multiple times in this episode. That's what he's trying to get people to thinking about. Some of these things that are sounding a little bit familiar, are they happening a bit more than they should? Well, perhaps you're on the road to that. So let's start thinking of some of these steps now and head you off before you get there. Step 2, intentionally engage with another human being. And this is one that he focuses a lot on in the bite-size episode. He says you're very unlikely to be able to get out of the rut by yourself. Shutting down and cutting yourself off is a sign of burnout, but it's very unlikely to help. And he talks about a patient who came to see him. And from the outside, everything looked great. He was a 37-year-old man, ran his own business, workaholic, making good money, great car, etc., etc. And he came to see Rangan, saying that he was concerned that he had depression. And he sometimes struggled to get out of bed in the morning. He was exhausted. Little things were bothering him. His creative spark seemed to have up and gone. He didn't want to spend time with people, and he was struggling to experience any joy in his life. He spent all his time pretty much alone. The kind of work he had meant he was just working by himself at home, and because he was working so much, he really wasn't interacting with other people. So Rangan prescribed him a weekly get-together with a friend. No phones on, you have to be completely present. And so this guy came back to see him 6 weeks later, feeling great. What he'd done was set up a weekly meetup in a coffee shop with friends where they all caught up on their weeks that they'd had. And then this ended up leading to a five-a-side football evening that he set up with his mates on Wednesday evening. So, he felt like he wasn't getting enough exercise. So one thing led to another. And one of the things that Rangan suggests is maybe putting some default group things in your diary. And they might not always happen, but you're more likely to be able to set it up as a routine if you put it in as a default, whatever it is. Every Wednesday evening we do this, or Sunday morning at the coffee shop, whatever it is. The third step to look at is sleep. Really important to prioritize sleep. And we mentioned this before, often feel tired and wired at the same time. And people tend to stay up late with Burnout. Just watch that. Another episode on Netflix. Little by little, he says, try and improve your sleep routine, because the knock-on effect next day will really start to improve. So that just one more episode at 10 o'clock at night, he says you're making a trade in that moment when you make that decision, and the impact of that on the next day is going to be less creativity, less empathy, less ability to solve problems, worse food choices, craving sugar, caffeine, etc., etc. So he talks about things that help improve sleep. We all know these, we've spoken about them before, but natural light first thing in the morning, as soon as you can after waking up, is a huge thing. Caffeine, try and keep it just to the morning. Impact varies person to person. And it also, he goes into talking a little bit about, really depends on how much stress you're under as well. So the impact caffeine might have on one particular person can vary a lot depending how stressed they are. Wind down an hour before bedtime. Our brain makes associations. So if you're used to sending work emails on your phone in bed, it's going to be harder to switch off when you're in bed. So you need to send your brain the signal you're no longer working. The brain needs the signal that you're relaxing and winding down. He says it might be worth setting a cut-off time, even using an alarm, an hour before bedtime, and when you stop certain activities and devices, and you go into relaxing activities. Even if it can still be the TV, but watch something relaxing. Don't watch the news before you go to bed. Step 4, do something that you love every day. He says it makes you more resilient to stress. But being chronically stressed, particularly work-related stress, means you find it harder to gain pleasure in everyday things. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle. So 5 minutes a day, or more if possible, prescribe yourself something that is just for you that you love doing. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Reading a book, listening to music, watching your favorite comedian on YouTube. A daily dose of pleasure will help build resilience. He talks about a patient that he gave a prescription of getting his old train set out of the attic and playing with it. They'd had a conversation about what he used to like doing, and came back however many weeks later, and he talks about it and chatting to his wife, and he was a changed man because he spent 5 minutes every day playing with his train set. So there's always something. Step 5, learning how to say no. Lots of people struggle with this. We tend to do things to help people, but it can start to be at the cost of your own health and well-being. A reason a lot of people struggle to say no is that they're people pleasers. In order to feel loved and liked, we need to do things for other people, but that's a really problematic cycle. And he says one of the things that can help is weighing up the consequences of decisions on both sides. When you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else. And we often don't think about the latter. Rangan talks about himself, and he says that if he says yes to a weekend speaking engagement, which he loves to do, he's saying no to time with his wife and children. So his decision, he now has a default decision that he doesn't do weekend speaking engagements. He's just made that his default decisions. And sometimes he'll make an exception, but his default is no. So if you have your default as no, you can then ask yourself, well, can I make a case for saying yes? It's very hard to do at first. Think clearly about why you're saying no, and then be honest and clear about why. And you might actually be surprised with the reception. Being able to say no in a truthful, authentic way is a really good skill to acquire. And he says he was surprised at this. You know, a friend asked him to do something over. People who listen to Rangan will know that he takes August away from work and social media and all sorts of things. And somebody asked him to speak at some kind of conference or something. And he said no, and he said why, and they were fine with it. You know, they completely understood. Step 6, schedule rest. Once you're better at saying no and putting up boundaries, you'll have more time. But then you have to decide how to use that time. Because with proper rest time, we can come back stronger and more resilient. You can deal with more stress if you put in the right amount of rest. Your stress recovery will improve. So can you put something in your diary regularly? It says you'll put work commitments in the diary, so why not put rest and recovery time slots in your diary too? Walking is one of the most useful things to do. 15 minutes at lunchtime with no technology. Come back with more creativity. It's better than working through lunch. And he talks about the default mode network. This helps us solve problems and be more creative, or they're two of the things that it does, but it only gets activated when you switch off from a task. That's why things come to us when we're in the shower or out for a walk. Step 7, movement. One of the things that tends to happen on the way to burnout is you stop moving your body, low energy. Movement, though, is guaranteed to change your state of mind, and it can actually give you more energy. The 8th step, pay attention to your food intake. Nutrition tends to slide on the road to burnout, comfort food. But the sad fact is it tends to make matters worse. Really tricky one, this one. But he says, just try to keep things in stock that will support you rather than harm you. And just think about how often you're comfort eating, and try to pause before you do that next time and ask yourself, what are you really trying to comfort in that moment? And can you soothe yourself another way? Step 9, define the end of your work day. To-do lists, he says, they're never completed these days. It's really hard to control, and it's really easy to be working all the time. So he says you need a cut-off time, and you need to actively do that. It's no longer, or generally anyway, it's no longer the end of the day for a lot of people when you leave work. Work comes home with you. And he quotes a podcast guest he had on called Greg McKeown, who says, if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. So he says you have to define what done is for you. That might be a set time, or it might be finishing a certain number of the most important tasks, whatever it is. But define at the start of the day what done is. And the last one, this is a bigger picture thing. Daily actions that aren't aligned with our values tends to have a huge impact. Now, it's not always something that you can easily change, but doing a job that you don't enjoy or that is not aligned with your values can really negatively impact you. And he says one thing that's useful to do is write down your 3 core values, and do this reasonably regularly, and try to bring them to every aspect of your life. And if they are not there, could you try moving towards them? And check in regularly to see how much of your life is in accordance and how much is in conflict with these 3 core values. So what do you really want out of life? And he says that his 3 core values are integrity, compassion, and curiosity. That's what his are at the moment. And so that's what he tries to bring to every part of his life. He ends by saying, as he always says, pick one thing, start small, and build up with time. I've rattled through, but I thought that was nothing overwhelmingly different from some things we've talked about before, but I thought he put it in quite a clear way.
Yeah, and they're all very actionable things. It's not like really esoteric kind of things that are hard to do. I'm pretty sure I've shared this here, and sometimes I've run into listeners who know what we have said more than we remember what we have said. And you always have a better memory of this, Daisy. But Simon Sinek, who a lot of people have kind of followed as a motivational speaker, entrepreneur, he has a quote about this, and I didn't look it up while you were talking, but basically he says that hard work for something that we don't value is called stress, and working hard for something that you love is called passion. And I don't remember which number it was, but you talked about really identifying your values and what's important to you and making sure that you can incorporate that in some way. If this is specifically about work burnout, can you incorporate that into your work life? If this is relationship burnout or just life burnout or whatever. But I think that is really important, that if we are just working hard and it's not something that feels like it has kind of intrinsic value to us, we're going to feel more stressed. But working really hard, even maybe double the amount, for something that holds some really important values for you, won't feel as taxing or as stressful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know you've talked about before kind of shifting that core value slightly. So if you are working at a job that you maybe don't enjoy, or you can't find that core value in the job, but sometimes you can manage a way of reframing it to make it that you're doing that to fulfill a core value somewhere else. But it's tricky, isn't it? Because if the stress and the burnout is coming from your job and you can't easily change that, how do you fix it?
When I was working as a therapist, it wasn't uncommon to be, working with someone who was really working on this rub of, my work is really stressing me out. I'm really getting burnt out, and that's creating stress in my life. And yet not feeling like they could leave that job and move to something else. And unless it was something like they were being abused at work or harassed at work, I would try to help them figure out what aspects of work can I look at differently so that they feel more fulfilling or they feel better to be doing, if I can't just leave and find something that naturally feels more fulfilling to me. But that's a complicated mix there. It's funny, after you kind of shared your question early on about kind of the overlap with depression and burnout, I was really listening as his suggestions. And I think these are really good suggestions for both burnout and depression. One of the complexities in either is that we don't have a lot of energy. Like you said, with burnout, there's often physical exhaustion involved. So of course, eating well, not eating things that make your blood sugar crash, sleeping well, getting quality sleep, movement. I think walking is the greatest one. I love that he put that in there. I think all of those things are really important ways to help us physiologically kind of combat the impact of burnout.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because when you're in it, you don't feel like doing the things. Even if you know full well what things will help, you don't feel like doing it for whatever reason, because you're physically exhausted or mentally exhausted, or you've shut down, or whatever it is. That's the difficult thing, I always think, with you're in this kind of spiral, and you've just got to find the little thing that will just sort of stop it spinning the wrong way and try and start taking it the other way. So that's where he always talks about just try one little thing at a time and see if it can make a difference.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think every time you've shared something from him, or every time I've listened to him, it makes me think, gosh, I wish I had a doctor that prescribed, hey, put some of these things in your calendar, versus, hey, let's take another dose of that and more of this. I love his approach to that. And like you said, I think he's very realistic about not trying to overwhelm patients or us as listeners to, well, yeah, you're just going to have to buckle down and do this and this and this and this to make that better, which is going to make us feel worse. But he breaks it down into really more palatable increments that can help us change the momentum.
Yeah, it's a shame everyone's doctor isn't like Rangan.
Yeah, I have to think, well, I don't know anything about his practice at this point, but at some point, I would imagine his was so popular, there'd be lines in the street waiting to get in to see him.
Yeah, I bet. And he was on TV for a while. I can't remember what it was called now, Doctor in the House or something. There were some really good episodes of those. And they're very memorable. There was some guy that he figured out he needed vitamin B supplements, and he'd gone from being off work and doing really badly to just suddenly feeling better. Yeah, it was quite remarkable. But anyway, off on another tangent again. So yeah, if any of that sounded familiar, I strongly suggest go and listen to Rangan talk about his 7 signs that you might be heading to burnout and his 10 practical steps, because he obviously covers it much better. And it wasn't one of his marathon episodes either. It was like an hour and a half or an hour and a quarter or something.
But it also sounds well worth it.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, well, until I see you next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.